very good morning. The early morning, 6 o'clock. So unusual, right? So welcome to the batch of HR for 2025 Prelims, right? And initial 15-20 minutes, I would just give you a brief details of what are we going to do in specific across the sessions, and post which we would enter into our first subject, that is polity, right? And if you would have seen the schedule as such with respect to polity, you would have seen that not only polity, on an average, every subject has been running for 4 to 5 days, right? Now, one basic thing that we would cover in the context of the course is we would have one is with respect to the concepts and the conceptual clarity that we are going to ensure. First thing. Why? Because these days prelims has become a game of basics, right? Forget about the intellectual aspects of prelims. We are more focused towards the basic dimensions of prelims, be it your 2024 paper or be it your 2023 paper, although people would say 2023 was little hatke, but more or less, if your basics are strong, I think basics would sail you through first. The second thing that we would look at, the dimension of this particular course, is we would look at how to apply these basics. In the sense, sometimes UPSC has been focusing more with respect to application of these basics, and that is where the questioning pattern is turning into a tough dimension. For the reason that because we know that there is so much of material out there, there is so much of information, there are so many kinds of debugging of the prelims goes on with respect to the subject and with respect to non-subject. So in that context, what would UPSC want to focus upon to a larger extent is UPSC would want to focus upon application rather than rote learning, right? Although sometimes UPSC gets little notorious with respect to questioning rote learning, right? And that rote learning to a larger extent would happen only in the context of current affairs, right? The rote learning would go on with respect to current affairs. For example, if you look at 2016, there was one question recently, there was a banana which was found, and in which of these following regions we found this banana, right? So in that context, it gets extremely difficult to actually even comprehend and think about those questions. So in that context, current affairs would be dealt with respect to the factual dimensions in 5 days, which we would be dealing somewhere 45 to 50 days before the exam, right? Because that is what is a rough coverage that we generally see from the side of UPSC. These 5 days of current affairs, which is 30 hours of current affairs, which you would be covering them, would approximately cover 1.5 hours, right? Sorry, 1.5 years. It would approximately cover 1.5 years, in the sense that, sir, how can you cover 1.5 years in 30 hours? All that you need to know is you need to know what can be asked, what cannot be asked, right? If you're able to demarcate those dimensions, we can happily cover those 1.5 year current affairs in 30 hours. The third aspect that we would fundamentally look across this session. Now, if you look at the course is approximately 40 to 45 days. In this, my major focus of keeping it for 40-45 days, I could have finished the course in 20 days also. I could have finished the course in 10 days, 15 days, 5 days, whatever. But the reason for keeping it for 40 to 45 days is more of the ideological transfer that has to happen, and more of building an orientation not only towards this particular stage of examination but also towards a particular question. Why? Because whenever you look at a person who is qualifying prelims and who is not qualifying prelims, the fundamental difference is how do you approach a respective question. If you are approaching a respective question in just a rote learning dimension, sometimes the question becomes extremely difficult. Now in that context, what happens? Now, for suppose if I have to just tell you, I don't know how many of you have seen that video that recently I had solved 2024 paper using, I called it as elimination techniques, but I would rather say it is more common sense. Now, when you go back and refer to 2024 question paper, there was one question on speaker. Now, many people tried answering that question on the basis of learnings that they have done. In the sense, they tried to recollect every dimension of the speaker, they tried to understand what is going on, and then they tried to eliminate the options. But in that context, what is happening is that is not the way we approach any question, because what happens is it is not only the negative marking which is going to chase you down in the exam, it is also the time which is allotted to each question which is chasing down. Right? Most of us do not even consider time because, sir, it is not mains examination, it is prelims examination. I don't think I need to be bothered about time. But trust me, my dear, there are days where people did not read 20 questions towards the end. Or there are days where people could not read 10 questions, 15 questions, could not read the options, could not answer them. So what is one fundamental dimension is these two aspects of prelims examination are chasing you down across the timeline that is existing there. Right? Now, just because I'm running out of my time, I can't randomly go for marking. And just because I want to mark something, I cannot mark because there is negative and time which is turning around. Because approximately, if you look, you would be having just 1.2 minutes for each question. If I just split it in very, very raw calculation, 120 minutes for 100 questions, it is approximately 1.2 minutes for each. Now, when I say it is approximately 1.2 minutes for each, now that is roughly how much? Roughly around 80 seconds, right? It is roughly around 80 seconds. Or when I say it is 80 seconds for a question, what happens is when it is a multiple statement based question, it becomes tough to recollect, to apply. So in that context, all that I am going to do for next 40-45 days is ideological transfer and orientation. Right? If I look at a question, should I eliminate and arrive at the answer? Should I select the option? Should I actually go by some kind of shortcut that can be applied in the question? All of those we are going to learn over a period of time. Right? And one more, some basic techniques. Now you please understand, my dear, I wanted to clarify again. I am not teaching you a magical spell through these techniques, no. Right? My fundamental focus is not to teach you a magical spell through this technique, but my fundamental focus is a question can also be solved using a technique. Now, because there is one thing which goes on in the UPSC circles is, I don't know, somebody even commented just below my elimination techniques video. So I wanted to pick up and speak about that. There is one norm and there is one kind of misconception that goes on with respect to UPSC, that UPSC prelims can only be qualified if you study. You have to understand studying is a basis. That is what we are doing with respect to basics, conceptual clarity, and I will teach you the application dimension of those basics. One dimension is basics. The second dimension that you always have to understand is you would have to keep your genes of common sense activated. If you don't have the genes of common sense activated in this context, what is going to happen is, it is extremely difficult for us to arrive at an optimum figure of 70 questions with 75% accuracy. Why am I telling this on as we progress across? This is an optimum figure that I would say with respect to 70 questions with 75% accuracy. Now when I say 75% accuracy, it's approximately how much? 3/4, right? So you take something which is easy, right? So it is approximately 18 threes are, I think 54. 54, 18, so 108, 18 must be like 12. Then your net score would somewhere land up at 96. So in the sense, when you look at with an accuracy of 75%, if you are attempting 70 questions, my net score would land up somewhere in 96, which is a decently safe score in the recent past cutoffs. Now that means this is a calculative dimension that I would have to arrive at. Because some people say I attempt only 40 questions. Some people say I attempt only 30 questions. Some people say I attempt only 50 questions and I come out and I qualify prelims examination. Please understand there is no truth in this. Why? Because in UPSC Prelims, if I am getting 90% accuracy, it fundamentally means it is not UPSC. Why? Because the maximum accurate number of questions that I see in the examination is 30%. The rest 70% are not direct, but they are fundamentally dependent upon the derived knowledge that we are arriving at. Now, when we are arriving at a derived knowledge with 70%, how can I attain an accuracy of 90%? Impossible. So, keeping all of those in mind, if I have to get this magical figure of attempting 70 questions with 75% accuracy, all that I would have to do is answer those 30 direct questions correctly, one. And not only answer those 30 questions directly, I need to again phase up the game. I need to again level up the game somewhere with 40 additional questions. Now, when I want to solve these 40 additional questions, all that I would have to do is apply something. Because I definitely know it is going to go beyond my basic knowledge dimension. So, in that context, I am telling that you can solve UPSC questions using techniques. And I would not call them as elimination techniques if at all you are having some misconception, because many people say eliminations are eliminated. No, right? At least till 2023 I was using, and when I looked at 2024 paper, they were not eliminated. Now, in that context, eliminations are not some techniques, they are basic common sense. If I am able to apply those basic common sense dependent upon my basic understanding, I can happily derive an answer. Right? So, across these 40-45 days, we are all going to learn these dimensions. Right? Before I proceed into this, how many of you have already given the attempt? Prelims, once at least. Okay. How many of you are going to give your first attempt in 25? Interesting. Right? Now that means you have to fundamentally understand here that these four components would be taught, would be learned in next 40-45 days that we are keeping it, right? Now all that you can definitely try them in the test that you are writing, one, and all of them can be applied to any of the PYQ that you solve. Right? Now you always remember our basic solution basis and our basic reference basis would always be running around PYQs. And PYQs, to be very specific in the context of prelims examination, I would want you to finish the chunk of 2011 to 2024 first, right? But if you finish it is fine. If you're not finishing also it is fine. Why? Because we would see that we will be learning the subject for 5 days, right? Approximately we will be learning the subject for 5 days, and on the 6th day we would be solving all the PYQs which are related to that particular subject, and we would be learning the PYQs and we would be trying to apply to those PYQs which are spanned between 2011 to 2024, right? Because I can't just keep it very abstract when I say techniques. I can't just keep it very abstract when I say generalizations. For every subject, I would have bunch of generalizations which we are going to keep in mind. Why? Because these generalizations are going to become the basis for my common sense, basis for my techniques, basis for my application, basis for my solving any question which is out of my basic knowledge. Right? So what we are going to do is, before I start any subject, I will give you a bunch of generalizations, be it polity, be it geography, be it economy, be it history, be it whichever subject that we are dealing. We would have bunch of generalizations, then I would get into consolidations of the basic, then I would get into the conceptual clarities, then I would get into some applied dimensions, and in the last day of the particular subject, we will be dealing with PYQs, right? So this is how the course is going to be spanned, at least with respect to general studies. And regarding CSAT, you would have Surya sir fundamentally talking about CSAT, right? Keeping that basic premise with respect to exam, when you look at polity, right? I know all of you would be experts at this, right? No, because now this is one subject that we start off preparing for civil services as such, right? So when you look at polity in general, I would say this is a subject which is going to make or break your attempt. Extremely important subject, right? And I would definitely tell you, I think that is the reason why you study it first before you start preparation. Not because it is easy, not because we only have one specified source by our seniors, but it is extremely important in prelims examination whether you make it or break it. Now, when I say in the context of prelims examination, when you make it or break it, approximately I would see 15 questions from polity and some ranges up to 18 questions. Now, for example, in 2024, we had approximately 18 questions coming from polity. So, when you look at this 15 to 18 questions of a range, what do we generally observe? I would divide this into three. One is approximately 10 questions would be around our basic understanding, right? For which I don't see any better source other than Lakshmikant, right? I don't see any other better source other than Lakshmikant. Let's narrow it down to Lakshmikant, at least in the context of prelims examination. Right? If you would have read some other book, it's fine. But as an individual who has an experience with this examination, I would definitely tell you that there are multiple instances where UPSC picked up statements from Lakshmikant. Right? Not multiple instances. Every year we have some bunch of questions where UPSC picks up the statements from Lakshmikant. So in that context, what happens is Lakshmikant becomes a basic source for the basic understanding and the basic knowledge of those 10 questions. I would say approximately 3 to 4 questions would come from your applied dimension, that is more or less from the political thought or the political theory. Now, if you want to understand some basic resource for these 3 to 4 questions, I would say you restrict it to that political theory NCERT if you want. Right? So that is one particular source specification with respect to this 3 to 4 question chunk. And approximately 2 to 3 questions would pop up from current affairs. Right? Would pop up from current affairs. But sometimes what UPSC turns out to do, UPSC fundamentally tries to make this section very random sometimes. For example, in 2021, Gopal Iyengar committee. Now, suddenly there was one question which appeared on Gopal Iyengar committee, which is again an out of blue committee that you generally don't study. Right? Sometimes UPSC goes upon asking these prison rules, home guards. Right? For example, if you look at 2021, 2022, 2023, there was a streak of questions which was asked by UPSC on prisons. Right? Especially prison rules, home guards. Home guard was a question in 2023. Right? Prison was a rule, parole, furlough, all of this. That means something which is related to sentencing, something which is related to justice, something which is related to retribution. All of these were seen to be existing for 2-3 years. But suddenly in 2024, it tripped off the particular tendencies of asking on prisons. So what happens is definitely UPSC has a chunk of these 4 or 5 questions which keeps in its pocket just to make it a little random. Now always remember, if some of these elements come along, it is fine. But if some of these elements don't come along, this should sail you through in this subject. Now that means, if I have to be very, very specific in keeping the boundaries of the attempt with respect to polity, we should be having at least net 12 questions right. Why? Because my calculation is very simple, my dear. Right? Let me put that perspective here itself, and then I would transcend into the subject. Always remember, whenever I am talking about prelims as an examination, I would see that some subjects have to be strong, some subjects have to be average. I can't have some subject to be weak. Right? No subject can be weak and no subject can be left. At least till 2018, people used to say that we can leave medieval and go. But UPSC suddenly in 2019, it asked 7 to 8 questions from medieval. And that made the paper tough. Actually, 2019 was a simpler paper comparatively to 2018. But we saw the cutoffs normalizing at 2018 98 and 2019 98. Both the cutoffs were very similar. The fundamental reason why both the cutoffs were very similar, why? Because suddenly there was a area which was not asked previously and which increased the volume of questions. The same thing happened with 2024. What happened in 2024? Many thought UPSC was not asking upon physical geography. UPSC was focusing on mineral, UPSC was focusing on economic geography, UPSC was focusing on environmental geography. That means vegetation, and sometimes with respect to mineral distribution, sometimes with respect to agriculture. But suddenly last year, you suddenly see a flip happening with respect to UPSC. 19 questions coming from geography and major chunk of these questions from physical geography. So in that context, what happens is that gives you an imperative, an indication saying that I can never have some subject which is weak. I would have to have either it is a strong subject or either it is the strength and either it is an average subject. What is the game that is going to lie? The game that is going to lie is there are certain subjects which I can never keep them on the average. One subject which has to be strong at any cost is polity. Why? Because polity is that subject which actually has lesser component of randomness that is seen to be existing. Any other subject that is seen to be existing would have some random pop-ups in the question. Right? And would have some random pop-ups in the question, and when we have these random pop-ups, automatically what happens? It gets tough tackling those questions. You can never have polity as an average subject. Polity has to be strength. Economy has to be strength. Why again economy has to be strength? The tendencies of economy is approximately 10 questions you would have them direct. Because for example, it might be in the context of financial instruments, or it might be in the context of basic GDP, GVA, those calculations. So any chunk of these questions, what do we generally observe? We can have some basic dimensions coming from economy which are direct. Right? That means if I just know some basics, I'm able to answer some questions well there. So I can never have economy on the average side. Second, always remember, I can never have science and technology on the average side, but I would say somewhere between strength to average, beach mein. Why? Because again I see science and technology has its own share of questioning. Because when I observe science and technology as a questioning, approximately again 12 questions, 12 to 15 questions, and sometimes they can even go up to 18 to 19 questions. Now in some year, if UPSC takes this questioning to 19, right, that year it becomes little difficult for us to tackle this examination. But on an average, 12 to 15 questions generally come from science and technology, and when we have the chunk of questioning that is going on, you always have to remember I can never have science and technology on the average, but you need not have science and technology to be on the stronger side also. Why I am not telling that is because I see the randomness factor in science and technology is more. Randomness factor in science and technology is more. Now, sometimes it can come up with its own technology. Right? Many people were thinking in 2024, there was a question which was asked on hydrogel. Many people were thinking hydrogel was an out of blue technology. No. Right? Hydrogel has been a tendency from the side of UPSC from last 3 years. What is happening if you observe in science and technology, which I would elaborate when I am doing that particular subject, polymer chemistry and polymer technology has become a central stage for questioning in prelims examination. Now, in fact, many of the aspects that you learn, you don't learn polymer chemistry and polymer technology in specific. But you fundamentally have to understand UPSC is going for at least 2 to 3 questions. And when it would give you a sample size of going to, or when it would give you a sample size of saying that I'm going to shift to polymer chemistry in 2021, when it asked a question with respect to bisphenol A is used in the formation of which of the following, a straightforward question, and the answer was polycarbonate. Now in that question, that is a core polymer chemistry question, that is a core polymer technology question. And UPSC categorically gave you that, and suddenly in 2022 we see 3 questions coming from polymer technology and polymer chemistry. For example, polyethylene terephthalate, PET, PET bottles we say, no? Now there was a standalone question on this, there was a standalone question on biofilms. So in that context, what is UPSC doing? It is getting polymer chemistry into the central stage. And from this area, generally the randomness is seen to be increasing. So sometimes SNT I can never have on this set, but it has to be on the, at least the median, or if you are strong at SNT, fantastic. Right? Now there are some subjects which is of your personal choice, that is history, right? That is geography. But one more subject which can't be on weaker side is environment. Why environment can't be on the weaker side and why environment has to be on a stronger side? Because may not be with respect to the directness of the questions, but with respect to the number of questions that are being asked. The number of questions that are being asked in toto. Because you see, environment is such a subject which fundamentally converges with three different dimensions. Either it is converging with SNT, either it is having a standalone environment, either it is converging with geography. I see all three agglomerating, and most of the times UPSC comes up with question in this area or this area or this area, this area. Right? So that fundamentally means in toto, if I look again, the chunk of environment is going up to 20 questions. Why is the chunk of environment going up to 20 questions? Very simple logic. Civil services and Indian Forest Service have the same prelims examination. And you know that Indian Forest Service is more oriented towards forest, environment, tribe, that section. So in that context, you have to understand that UPSC would want to balance out the objectives of both the examinations. And when it want to balance out the objectives of both the examinations, the only opportunity that it has is increase the chunk of environment. So what is seen to be happening, the number of questions with respect to environment has been increasing, has been on a higher end tentatively. Right? Sometimes only in 2024 we see a lower end of environment existing, but before that, on an average, 18 plus questions from environment. Right? Although in 2024 we had a lesser share because geography increased, environment automatically decreased. So in that chunk, you have to understand environment cannot be average, it has to be your strength. These three are your strengths at any cost and will have to be your strength at any cost. Right? With respect to history, with respect to geography, this is your choice. Because I know that some of you, when you come across geography, it would suddenly result in a dyslexic condition. Right? That air mass will appear to be floating and you would also be floating along with that respective air mass. I know it is a little confusing, but it's your choice. Right? The same is with history. Why? Because history as a subject is voluminous. In a sense, you have a varied factual base to be remembered. Right? If you want to put history this side, fantastic. If it is this side, fine. But don't have any subject on a weaker end. So if I have to put a perspective, these three have to be strong. This cannot be average. These can be average, can be your strength. But one thing you please remember, we don't need to have all the 6 subjects to be the strength. Now keep this in mind, right? Ensure that we are not having all the 6 subjects are not my strength, and ensure that there is no subject which is my weakness. You do this game of prelims should be actually easy. Game of prelims examination should actually be easy because if you are able to divide and if you are able to partition this, things should sail you through. Right? So that is one simple understanding that you have to have with respect to the general understanding of prelims. Right? Now coming back to polity, there are some priority areas in the context of polity. Priority areas in the context of polity. Now, one particular priority area in the context of polity is the constitutional principles. Right? Every year we see one or the other question coming from constitutional principles any given day. One. The second priority area that we majorly see in the context of polity is from the section of fundamental rights, DPSP, fundamental duties. Now, when you look at this chunk of fundamental rights, DPSP and fundamental duties, what do we generally come across with respect to these is we see 3 kinds of questioning being asked from this. One kind of questioning is either direct from the verbatim, that is directly from the articles of this constitution being asked, one, or the second area can be with respect to what is the extent of convergence that is seen in this context. Now, one dimension that I was telling, along with verbatim, I can even add the nature of amendments which are seen to be exist. Right? The next one is the convergence which is seen to be existing between all three. The third dimension is case laws. The third dimension is case laws. Although they would not specify the name of the case, but they would fundamentally see an extended version of these dimensions. And to be very, very precise in this context of case laws, majorly these case laws are revolving around the golden triangle. Right? Majorly it is revolving around the golden triangle, that is 14, 19 and 21. Right? We see that most of the times UPSC, whenever it would want to ask an applicative or a derivative dimension of polity, it would look at these three articles. That is with respect to fundamental rights, DPSP and fundamental duties. The third area which UPSC is again focusing in the context of priority section is with respect to federalism. Now, in the context of federalism, majorly we see the center-state relations, right? Majorly we see in the context of center-state relations to be very specific in the legislative dimension, right? It is not looking at the executive dimension, it is hardly looking at the financial dimension, but majorly it is looking at the legislative aspects of center-state relations, right? And in that context, it might be the role of governor which has to be seen. Or it might be with respect to the schedule 7 which is seen to be existing, article 246. For example, if you look at 2016, there was one question with respect to article 249. Right? What is article 249 talking about? That Rajya Sabha can legislate upon certain state subjects. And they were asking you about what is the kind of majority that is required in that context. If you look at last year, there was one question, or 2024, there was one question with respect to the legislation on articles between 301 to 307. That is especially with respect to interstate trade. So in that context, what happens is legislative center-state relations has been one very, very important dimension in the context of polity. One more dimension that we see in the context of federalism has been the institutional perspective of federalism. That means it is fundamentally either focusing upon zonal councils, it is fundamentally either focusing upon finance commission, it is fundamentally either focusing upon Northeast Council, just like this year they had asked upon Northeast Council in 2024, or they are asking about Interstate Council, they are asking about tribunals with respect to what? Interstate river water, right? Tribunals, disputes. So in that context, one institutional dimension is definitely present with respect to federalism. Now, another dimension which is inevitably very, very important is the section of local governance. And when you look at this section of local governance, which is extremely important, I would say I can never imagine a question paper of UPSC without the 5th and the 6th schedule. Impossible. Impossible. Every year I would see one question coming from 5th schedule and 6th schedule without fail. Why? Because UPSC would want to indicate that it is inclusive in nature. UPSC would always have some effort to put a style statement when it is questioning matter. And I can never imagine a question paper without 5th and 6th schedule, and that has never happened at least in past 10 years. You can go and cross check, either there is a question on 5th schedule or either there is a question on 6th schedule. This year we had a question on 5th schedule, that is schedule areas. Who can add, who can define, who can demarcate, right? We would actually get into those dimensions as we progress across. So that is one definite dimension which has to be looked into. Now, another very, very important section that we see from the UPSC, either it is parliament or state legislature. Now, when we look at this parliament or state legislature, one definite section which is every year popping up is on the question on money bill or the question on constituent amendment bills. Inevitable, every year there is one question on money bill. Right? For example, 23, 21, 18, 19, 24. In 24 also, many people were confused just because they gave article 109. Many people were thinking that there is no relation of 109 with the money bill. Right? People have forgot article 110, people have forgot article 112, people have forgotten article 117. Now here you have to fundamentally understand that money bill is an important section. Right? Money bill is definitely an important section. One more dimension of this is it would focus upon the structure of the parliament. Now when I say structure of the parliament, a categorical difference might be seen to be asking between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, or maybe between Rajya Sabha and Legislative Council. Rajya Sabha and Legislative Council, and sometimes we also see Legislative Assembly and Legislative Council. A comparative analysis would actually sail us through this dimension. So one understanding with respect to this parliament section and the state legislature section is with respect to the structure of it. So this is another very, very important dimension which has to be kept in mind, especially with respect to questioning in examination. Now there is one more area which is again important in the context. I would say along with parliament, there is one section which is important with respect to defections. That is your 10th schedule. Right? Because I see more than 3 times it was asked a direct question. 10th schedule belongs to which of the following or is related to which of the following. Right here, 52nd constitutional amendment and 91st constitutional amendment, the respective understanding of those. Right? So that is one important area again. Now, apart from that, there are some miscellaneous sections which we generally come across. And in these miscellaneous sections which we generally come across, UPSC is focusing upon certain organizations. When I say UPSC focusing upon certain organizations, what does that imply? Right? Now, always remember, any organization that I would want to come across, or if I come across, maybe in the newspaper, maybe in the current affairs, maybe in the static dimension, I would only see 3 aspects of this organization being asked by UPSC. One particular dimension with respect to this organization which is being asked every year is under which ministry is the mandate of this organization existing. Right? One area is ministry. On a later date, I would tell you a simple trick that 99% of the times the ministry given by UPSC is incorrect. Right? I would show you, I would tell you, sir, how can you tell that? Are you an astrologer? I am not an astrologer, please. Right? How can you tell? Your observation. From where, sir? From PYQ, sir. Has it been true always, sir? 99.9%, sir. It has been true. Right? So, in that context, sir, you're cheating us. Fine. It's fine because I have to understand there is no ethics in a game of war. You have to understand that. There is no moral. Now, here I am not telling I'm breaching my morality or I'm doing something here. I'm playing little smart. I'm playing little smart. Now you have to understand, no sir, I'm very ethical. I will not use all of these tricks. I will not cheat UPSC. I will straightforward learn everything and attend the paper. Fantastic. Take a bow. Right? And itna to pakka hai ki if you're like this, your prelims would never happen. Right? What is the game here? Understand the game well. Right? Dribble the game around. And when I say dribbling the game around here, understand the ins and outs of the questioning that is going on by UPSC at any cost. Now, do you think UPSC do not know that we know that there is some trick like this? It knows. But why it continuously keep giving like this? It says, qualify. Take one question. Now, some people are like, no, I would speculate on this ministry also, sir. Fantastic. Right? UPSC would never happen, then you would have to try for that ministry only later on. Nothing is going to happen. You please understand there are tendencies and there are patterns which are followed by UPSC. Right? And all of my tricks are based on the tendencies and the patterns which are followed by UPSC. నిపుణుల పర్యవేక్షణలో మాత్రమే చేయబడతాయి. Right? And all of those would be taught to you, all of those would be shown to you with evidences. I would not randomly show them hawa mein, no. Right? I would show them with evidences and then probably you would understand that. The organization, ministry. One more is they would give the mandate of the organization. That means what is the functioning or what is the mandate or in which area is that particular organization functioning. 99.9% of the times the mandate of the ministry is a right statement. 99.9% of the time the mandate of the organization is a right statement. So that is one thing that you have to understand. That means one aspect with respect to the organization is ministry, most of the times it is wrong, whereas mandate has been right. The third area where it questions is with respect to what is the source of the formation of that particular organization. Now when I say what is the source of the formation of the particular organization, I know the organization can be either three. Either an organization can be constitutionally formed. When it is a constitutionally formed, I would say it is constitutional body. For example, in 2023, we had one question with respect to this. 2024, we had one. 2022, we had two questions. For example, if I'm able to recollect it correctly, it is a question on T-board, right? And it is a question on Central Groundwater Authority. In 2020, we had a question on Central Groundwater Authority. That means you have to categorically understand UPSC is again focusing upon this section. UPSC is again focusing upon this section. So one is either it is a constitutional body, or either it is a statutory body, or either it is a executive body. Right? Most of the times UPSC would not give about something called as executive body. Executive body for us would fundamentally imply non-statutory body. Executive body would fundamentally imply the non-statutory body with respect to this. So in this context, what you have to understand, that whenever I see any question to be existing on the organization, would be majorly spanned around these three. Right? We would again see when we are doing the PYQs and we would cross-check them. And in that particular context, you see this organization is either of these three. Nothing beyond this. Nothing beyond. One is either the ministry, one is mandate, one is the source. For example, if you look at 2019 question paper, there was one question with respect to Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board. Right? Now that is again an organization. Now the first statement, I still remember, if I am not wrong, it is a two statement based question. PNGRB, that is Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board, two statement based question, 2019. In that particular question, the first statement was telling it is the first regulatory body which has been established post independence. Now, do you think is it possible? Now, petroleum and natural gas regulation has come much later. Right? Now, when did we get independence, my dear? 19? What is Bakka? Isme kuch doubt hai kya? And you say, sir, we got independence in 1940. Although the process started there and although the symptoms of independence were shown, 1940 say. But 47 we got. Now from 1947, and if you are attempting the exam in 2019, do you think there could not have been any regulatory body which was established by them? Impossible. And India being a democratic country, India being a follower of constitutionalism as a fundamental principle, I can never have that. Now that means what am I doing here? Again, I am not knowing completely about PNGRB, but मेरे को इतना पता है कि it is not the first regulatory body. Why? Because my common sense says that I had 70 plus years of independence and that can never be the first body. So in that context, you please understand that I can't be speculating upon the information which I don't know, but I will have to derive the information which I don't know, for which the generalizations are going to come handy with respect to every subject that we tackle. Right? So this is what is the simple brief diagnosis of the priority areas that have to be focused in the context of polity. Now keeping this, these are some bunch of general principles for polity. These are some bunch of general principles for polity. The first and foremost general principle in the context of polity is you always be careful with respect to the words define, mention, present meaning. Whenever I see the statements of polity, sometimes it says that the constitution defines, constitution mentions, constitution gives the meaning of this particular philosophy. So in that context, you always be very, very careful when you're looking at these words. And one more, which is a point of confusion, is one word is original constitution and one word is constitution. Now both are very different again. Original constitution is what, my dear? The constitution minus amendments is original constitution. Constitution minus amendments means original constitution. That means the bare constitution which is present. No amendments. An amendment would fundamentally start being included from first amendment onwards. One simple understanding. The second thing that you need to understand here, apart from this original constitution, now here, none of the words in the constitution are defined. You please write that statement. None of the words in the constitution are defined. What is the logic behind this, my dear? The logic behind this is already we have roughly 300 plus articles. When we have 350 plus articles, what is the general characteristic of Indian constitution? Is it is elephantine in nature. It is already so voluminous. Now just imagine if I start defining every word, if I define what is sovereignty, if I define what is republic, if I define what is democracy, if I define what is justice, if I define what is equality, what is happening when the volume of the constitution increases? And you have to understand that law is a good law which is comprehensible, and that law is a good law which is easy to read, which is small, which is concise. But if I keep on increasing the bulge by defining it, that is illogical. So none of the words are defined. One. Some words are mentioned in the constitution. Some words are definitely mentioned in the constitution. Right? Please keep writing all of this, right? Some words are mentioned in the constitution. One more dimension that you have to understand, some words are present in the constitution. Some words are present in the constitution. The meaning is generally absent. The meaning is generally absent. And sometimes it also says the principles, right? Most of the times, the principles are present in the constitution. Most of the times, the principles are present in the constitution. Right? Now here one more thing that you have to understand. Now for suppose if I say the word cabinet. Cabinet was in original constitution or cabinet is in constitution? Cabinet is in constitution. Is it in original constitution? No. Please understand this. Secularism. Secularism. Constitution. Was it in original constitution? No. Principles of secularism. Was it original constitution? Yes. Are you understanding why am I talking about these words as general principles? Principles of secularism was present in original constitution. But the word secularism was not present in original constitution. The word has been present in constitution. That means the constitution here fundamentally implies the original constitution plus necessary amendments which have been made. Right? That is one simple understanding, and that is what is one general principle that we have to follow in polity. The second dimension or the second general principle is whenever I see a question on concept being asked, whenever I see a question on concept being asked, most of the times, the statement which is broad, most of the times the statement which is broad, the statement which is positive, the statement which is positive, the statement which is inclusive, the statement which is inclusive, and the statement which is comprehensive. That means generally when you see any question on a concept being asked, you would see the option which is broad, the option which is comprehensive, the option which is positive, and the option which is inclusive is the correct answer, is the correct option. Now we would check these when we are doing PYQs, don't worry. If you want to check it on your own, go back and refer to 2017 with respect to the principles of liberty, 2018 with respect to principles of equality, 2019 with respect to social capital, right? 2020 with respect to constitutionalism. So you can go back and refer 2021 with respect to a question on state. Which of the following statements define state? All of these are what? Broad questions. All of these are what? Broad concepts. And whenever I see these broad concepts being present, my right answer would always exist with that statement which is broad, which is positive, which is comprehensive, which is inclusive in nature. Right? This is one simple general principle that we have to follow. The third general principle that we have to understand in the context of polity always, right? Especially when you talk about polity, always remember, center is the king. Why center is the king? What is the nature of our federalism? Quasi-federal, right? More unitary, less federal. Now, sometimes when we have an issue with respect to the jurisdiction of state legislator and the parliament or the center, always remember in all of this who is going to win over? Definitely it is going to be won by the center, right? Always remember that center is the king in the context of polity, right? It might be very autocratic in nature, but it might be very authoritative in nature, but that is a general principle that we have observed across all the statements, and that is a general principle that we have observed across all the principles of federalism. The fourth general principle that we always have to understand is citizens first, government next. Citizens first, government next. But governance best. Prasagada. That is how the principles are framed. Okay? Right? Citizen first. Now, when I say there is a fight between government and citizen, who wins? Citizen. Why? Constitution. In the preamble, we the people of India. We give it to us. Right? That means people have given the constitution to whom? To themselves. And government is a derivative of constitution, or constitution is a derivative of government? Government is a derivative of constitution. So, citizen first, government next. And what is this governance best? Whenever I see some principles of good governance, whenever I see the principles of good governance, especially in any of my statements, without thinking and without having a second thought, please mark that statement correct. Please mark that statement correct without any second thought. Right? Now, all this would again start making sense only when we solve them in PYQs. I would show you. Every statement has a substantiation, not in 1 year, but out of the span of 13 years from 2011 to 2024, I can definitely show you evidences more than 60%. Now, that means if it is above 50%, definitely it is a trend which is seen to be happening. Right? If it is less than 50%, then it is accidental. But if it is more than 50%, definitely I can tell you that it is a pattern which is followed. Right? So, whenever I see these principles of good governance, the statement is generally right. That is with respect to participation. That is with respect to consensus. That is with respect to equity and inclusion. That is with respect to efficiency and effectiveness. That is with respect to accountability. That is with respect to transparency. That is with respect to a responsive nature. Responsive nature. Responsive nature means the way the government is redressing the grievance. Grievance redressal. How is the grievance redressal seen to be happening? Right, with respect to the grievance redressal, what is it going on? How is it going on? That is what is one fundamental dimension. Responsive, transparency, participation, consensus, equity and inclusion, efficiency, right, accountability. And not only that, if some ethical principle goes beyond the principles of good governance, some ethical principles, I think you would have read your GS4 syllabus, right? Honesty, integrity, those basic dimensions. So, the fourth principle is the citizen is the first, the government is the next, and governance is the best. Now, why governance is the best? Because it gives me a correct option, right? I would show you. So, remember these general dimensions again. The fifth general principle that we generally come across in polity. The fifth general principle that we generally come across in polity, especially whenever we are solving these organizations questions, I told you that the general principle is, in the context of organization, wrong ministry and a right mandate. Wrong ministry and a right mandate. Right? That is the fifth general principle that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about this. Sir, has it been correct always? 99.9%. 0.1% probability, theek hai yaar, chalega. Right? That fundamentally depends upon our certain speed. I can't do anything. Right? But 99.9% of the times it is correct. So, iska matlab, when it is 99.9% times it is correct, I think I can't have a probability of 1 always. Maximum 0.9. Right? So, fifth principle that you have to remember is with respect to organization. The sixth principle that you have to always remember here, one extension of this, in the context of international organizations, that I am just putting in some IR also as cluster of polity. Right? Although we would discuss more details of international relations and current affairs, but some general principle with respect to this, you always remember in the context of international organization, none of the mandates are mandatory or binding. None of the mandates are mandatory or binding. Right? Now that might be with respect to 2021 question, 2022, 2019, 2024. Recently there was one question on World Toilet Organization, or there was one question on International Grain Council. Right? Now when you go back and refer to International Grain Council, and when you look at the second statement of International Grain Council, the first statement of International Grain Council says that India is the member of IGC. Probably. Why? Because we are the largest producers of food grains. The second statement of IGC is what it says, that the necessary permissions from the International Grain Council has to be taken for India to export its wheat or rice. That means, what is it saying? A binding nature is being imposed on the policy making of India. Now always remember, nothing is binding. Nothing is mandatory. None of the mandates of the international organizations are mandatory and imposed on the country. Right? So these are the 6 general principles that we are going to operate upon whenever we are solving the questions. Is this clear? Right? So I think by now the tempo has been set. Initially, I would tell you what is the weightage in the exam for every subject. I would tell you what are the priority areas in that particular subject. Right? When I'm telling you the weightage only, we would fundamentally restrict our sources. Why? Because over a period of time, you start diversifying unnecessarily because of the peer influence. Right? Somebody would say read Subhash Kashyap. Somebody would say read D.D. Basu. Somebody would say read Constituent Assembly debates. Somebody would say read Baer Act. Right? Multiple. But my understanding with the examination, and as a person who has cleared all 6 prelims, my understanding is Lakshmikant is more than sufficient for those 10-12 basic kind of questions. Definite. But the miscellaneous section will have to be handled with a different approach. Okay? So I would tell you the weightage, priority areas. Then we would get into general principles for every subject. Right? For all of those who have already heard my geography class, you would know that. That is how I deal with the subject. And when you look at that, in geography, we would have 10 general principles. Right? Here, we have 6 general principles with respect to polity. And then I would get into the basic understandings. Okay? So, the next chunk that we're going to enter is the basic understanding of constitution, constitutionalism, constitutional morality. Now, when you look at this constitution, constitutionalism and constitutional morality, one simple understanding that you have to have is constitution is nothing but a legal document. Constitution is nothing but a legal document, and it is the fundamental basis of governance. It is the fundamental basis of governance, and it has certain directives to the citizens and the state. It has a certain directives to the citizen and the state. And one more dimension is constitution as such can be modified. Constitution as such can be modified, but principles should be upheld. Constitution can be modified, but principles should be upheld. Right? That means I can modify the constitution, but I cannot modify the principles behind the constitution. And that is where we say basic structure doctrine comes into the picture. On a later date, we would just discuss about that. Right? Now, when you look at constitutionalism as an understanding, when you see constitutionalism as an understanding, right, you believe it or not, UPSC have this tendency of asking constitutionalism, right? For 5 years continuously it asked. In prelims examination, what do you understand by constitutionalism? What do you understand by limited government? 5 years continuous, right? So when you look at constitutionalism as an understanding, it is a specific limitation. It is a specific limitation on a general state. It is a specific limitation on general state. It prevents arbitrary nature or arbitrary decisions. It prevents arbitrary decisions, and we see the citizens prevail over government. The citizens prevail over government, and wherever we see citizens prevailing over government, that is with respect to the principle of constitutionalism, right? Now, one caution of note again, whenever we are making notes, especially with respect to class, we are making something called as a snippet form of notes. What is the snippet form of notes? That we would be having snippets. That means this is one snippet, and that is a snippet which is related to what? Constitution. This is one snippet which is related to the thing called as constitutionalism. Now, what would my snippet constitute? My snippet would constitute an analysis of PYQs. My snippet would constitute an analysis of multiple sources, and my snippet would constitute what probable statements can be asked in future. So it would constitute previous year questions, it would constitute future year questions also, and along with the necessary basic understanding of that particular concept, right? So that is what is going to constitute our snippet. Don't feel mean for your pages, right? If you want, I would go out and raise funds for your books, right? And I can contribute, I can give. But humble request is don't be mean with respect to pages. Why? Because some people, if this is the page, you divide it. This is fine. Some people would divide it like this. Now, however big the snippet is, the whole of the snippet will be written here, right? First of all, it's fine now. But on a later date, when you pick up to revise just 1 week before the examination, it appears extremely frustrating, right? And in that context, you feel like tearing, Oddu, right? Because it is your effort, my effort, and I know that you are going to put a lot of effort, because for 40 days you will have to get up at 5 o'clock to come to class at 6 o'clock. Acha, is somebody getting up at 5:55 and directly bumping into the class? Huh? Right? Daichesi. Some basic etiquette, right? And you please enter the class. Right? I know all of you would be following my assumption. Okay. So, constitutionalism is talking about what? It is talking about the dimensions with respect to preventing the arbitrary nature and the citizens prevail most of the times, right? And you also remember, most of the legislations would fundamentally have a principle of this, right? Most of the legislations would fundamentally have a principle of this, and always remember, there is one exception which is seen to be existing with respect to constitutionalism. What is this exception that is existing with respect to constitutionalism? The reasonable restrictions which have been put in. The reasonable restrictions which have been put in here, because what happens is when you look at these reasonable restrictions, you know that the reasonable restrictions are what restrictions which are imposed on the citizen. Constitutionalism is that restriction which is imposed on the state or the government, right? So one exception that we generally come across here is the reasonable restrictions are a kind of exception to this. One. Now, when you look at constitutional morality as such, it is all about adherence to the values and principles of constitution. Adherence to values and principles of constitution. For example, uniform civil code is a constitutional morality. Uniform civil code is a constitutional morality, right? So that is one fundamental dimension, because when you look at morality, there are three kinds of moralities which exist. One is Victorian. The Victorian morality is that which is established by British. The social morality which is established by the principles of society and the social sanctions which are seen to be existing. And the third one is the constitutional morality. The constitutional morality which is established by the principles of constitution. Right? So constitutional morality is talking about the strict adherence to the principles of constitution is what is called as constitutional morality. Right? Now here, with that basic understanding, the next dimension that you would have to study here is, we know that all of these are applied to a particular state, but we see there is one small difference that is seen to be existing between state and nation. Now here, whenever you talk about a particular state, you see that any particular state which is seen to be existing will have a respective territory, which is considered to be a legal entity, and it would have the dimensions of sovereignty. It would have some population which is considered to be the citizens. Always remember, we can't call them as subjects, but they are the citizens. And we have a respective political setup. And the respective political setup is what is the government which is seen to be existing. So a state is that which has a legal entity, which is a legal entity, which has a territory, which has citizens, or which has population, which has political setup, and which is known to have some element of sovereignty that is seen to be existing. But whereas when you look at nation, you see that nation is more defined in the cultural context. Nation is more defined with the cultural context. Right? Write down one line. Boundaries of state are not coterminous with the boundaries of the nation. The boundaries of the state are not coterminous with the boundaries of the nation. Right? Next, Article 12. Article 12 defines the state. Article 12 defines the state as one, government and parliament of India. 2, government and legislature of each state. 3, all the local and other entities in territory of India. All the local and other entities in territories of India and under government of India. Next, in R.T. Shetty versus Airport Authority of India, 5 points have been mentioned as a criteria. 5 points have been mentioned as a criteria to test the grounds of state. Under that first point, state as main funding source. 2, deep and pervasive control by state. 3, functional character. 4, government department transferred to corporation. 5, monopoly status conferred or protected by government. right? Next, according to AR Anatulya versus RS Naik, it states that court cannot pass through. It states that court cannot pass the orders, court cannot pass the orders violative of fundamental rights. Violative of fundamental rights. Next, according to interpretation of Article 12, next paragraph, according to interpretation of Article 12, judicial reforms by judiciary are not considered. Judicial reforms by judiciary are not considered. But whereas the administrative functions of the judiciary are considered. Whereas the administrative functions of judiciary are considered. Yes, right? Now moving back to these dimensions of constitutionalism. Now, is the word constitutionalism mentioned in your constitution? Is the word constitutionalism mentioned in your constitution? No, that is not mentioned in your constitution. One. The second one that you have to understand here is the principles of constitution, are they mentioned in your constitution? Yes. Right? The principles are there, but the word is not present. Right? And one more thing that you also have to understand here. When you look at Rameshwar Prasad case in the context of Supreme Court was also telling that constitutionalism as a principle would promote more objectivity in administration. Now, in case if tomorrow if there are some multiple statements on constitutionalism, and if there is one statement says that constitutionalism promotes objectivity, definitely yes. Right? If I don't know Rameshwar Prasad case, I can still answer this to be right, because objectivity is one of those good governance principles. Objectivity is one of those good governance principles. I can still answer it correct. So constitutionalism as such would promote objectivity with respect to, or with reference to, Rameshwar Prasad case. And one extension that we were discussing is, we can also say that the constitutionalism is nothing but a limited government. Constitutionalism is nothing but limited government. That is one simple understanding. Or if not limited government, we can also say it is a constitutional government. We can also say it is constitutional government. Now here that means I can have two kinds of governmental systems, because you see that one of the characteristic feature of the state is what? One of the characteristic feature of the state is the political setup which is seen to be existing. And when you look at these government systems, I can see there can be two kinds. One is the constitutional government. The other one is the non-constitutional government. One is the constitutional government, the other one is non-constitutional government. Now write down what constitutes a constitutional government. One, election process. One is election process. and elected by public. Election process and elected by public. 2. Head of state with limited powers. Head of state with limited powers. 3. A specific tenure. Specific tenure. Whereas non-constitutional government, under non-constitutional government, no elections, rulers with unlimited power, no elections, rulers with unlimited power. No limitation on tenure. No limitation on tenure, right? And the next thing that we generally come across is forms of government. I see that there can be 2 different forms of government in general. I can see 2 things which are seen to be present. One is the parliamentary system, the other one is the presidential system, right? With the re-election of Donald Trump to United States and with him establishing a separate department and a separate wing of governance of efficiency, right? So I think again the presidential system and the respective demarcation and the debate over parliamentarian system comes in. Why? Because always this debate has been live with respect to why can't India have a presidential system? Why can't India have? The fundamental aspect is the parliamentary form of government is a basic structure, part of basic structure, right? And that which is part of basic structure is what? Cannot be amended, cannot be changed. And you also have to understand the amending power of the parliament by itself is limited, and which is part of basic structure again. The limited power to amend by itself is part of basic structure. So although I see, forget about the philosophical constraints which are existing, but I would definitely see procedural constraints to be existing for me to transition from a parliamentarian system to presidential system. Just write the basic difference between both. Parliamentarian system, dual executive, collective responsibility, political homogeneity, fusion of powers, dissolution of lower house, Now under presidential system, single executive, no responsibility, political homogeneity is not necessary. Separation of powers, right? And lower house has fixed term. Now what is the core difference that you observe? You see that in parliamentarian system, the executive responsible to legislature. But whereas in the context of presidential system, executive are independent. They are independent. They are independent, but whereas in the context of parliamentarian system, we see that executive are responsible to or accountable to the legislature. Right? In the context of India, you see that the Council of Ministers are accountable to whom? Council of Ministers are answerable and accountable to Parliament or Lok Sabha? Lok Sabha. It is not Parliament, right? It is Lok Sabha. So one fundamental understanding is this, right? And from this particular relation itself, we see the emergence of no confidence motion. That just because we see that the Council of Ministers are responsible to or answerable and accountable to Lok Sabha, we see no confidence motion as a phenomena emerging that because of that relation. And we would also see that no confidence motion is only restricted to Lok Sabha because these are responsible only to Lok Sabha. We don't have no confidence motion in Rajya Sabha, please. Right? When we are discussing Parliament, we would discuss about the tools which are available with respect to the Parliament. Are you understanding this, right? So this is one fundamental dimension with respect to the forms of government. Now from here, next, preamble. Preamble. Write down. Part of Constitution. Part of Constitution. Based on objective resolution. Based on objective resolution. Considered as identity card and horoscope of Constitution. Considered as identity card and horoscope of Constitution. Next, derives authority from public. Derives authority from public. Constitutes specific objectives. Constitutes specific objectives. Provides the nature of Indian state. Provides nature of Indian state. Used by judiciary. Used by judiciary for constitutional interpretations. Used by judiciary for constitutional interpretations. Non-justiciable in nature. Next, non-justiciable in nature. Can be amended. Can be amended without affecting the basic structure. Can be amended without affecting the basic structure. Inspired from US Constitution. Next, inspired from US Constitution. How many times was it amended? Amended once. Amended once. Which one was that? 42nd Constitutional Amendment. What was added? Socialist, secular, integrity. Socialist, secular, integrity. Right? We know the basis for preamble is objective resolution. Write down certain principles of objective resolution or composition of objective resolution. First, independent and sovereign India. independent and sovereign India. All power derived from people. All power derived from people. Social, political, economic justice. Social, political, economic justice. Freedom of thought and expression. Freedom of thought and expression. Promotion of peace and welfare. Promotion of peace and welfare. Right. Next to this point in bracket you write not in preamble. Next to this particular point in bracket you write not in preamble. Preamble is what? What do we have? Objective resolution is what? That which inspired preamble. Okay. So the promotion of peace and welfare is not there in preamble. Do we have it? Right? The principles of it? हो सकता है. Why? We have the dimensions of unity and integrity. So in that context, it fundamentally talks about peace and welfare, right? So promotion of peace and welfare. Next, safeguard for minority. Safeguard for minority, tribal. Safeguard for minority, tribal, and backward class. And backward class. Safeguard for minority, tribal, and backward class. Is it in preamble? It is not in preamble. Right? Is it part of preamble? No. Is it part of constitution? Yes. Right? Please in bracket you write this. It's not part of preamble, but it is part of constitution. Next. Basic structure doctrine. Is it mentioned in constitution? Is it defined in constitution? Yes? No? I don't. Neither mentioned nor defined in constitution. Neither mentioned nor defined in constitution. Next. A judicial innovation. A judicial innovation. Next. Ensures functioning of the government. Ensures functioning of the government and liberty of society. Ensures functioning of the government and liberty of society. Next, restricts the amending power of parliament. Restricts the amending power of parliament. Under Article 368. Under Article 368. Does it have a fixed composition, my dear, or it keeps varying? It keeps varying, right? No fixed list or features. No fixed list or features. It is considered case by case basis. It is considered case by case basis. Now tell me, is it present only in India? Huh? Tell me any other country which has some principle very similar to basic structure doctrine. Bangladesh? Any other? I don't. It is present in other countries as well. It is present in other countries as well. For example, Malaysia and Pakistan. Pakistan you can never forget as an example. Right? Right? Now one more small addition. Some of the important features of this BSD, basic structure doctrine. Why? Because in last 1 year there have been multiple discussions on BSD, right? Especially after passing away of Keshavananda Bharati. Yes? Adke unnadu ayana? Ema? Is he alive still? Please. Right? Centered around that we have multiple discussions going on. Right? So uske hisab se please write down. First is supremacy of constitution. Supremacy of constitution. Limited power to amend. Limited power to amend. Parliamentary system of government. Parliamentary system of government. Free and fair elections. Free and fair elections. Judicial review and judicial independence. Judicial review and judicial independence. Individual freedom. Individual freedom. Harmony and balance between fundamental rights and DPSP. Harmony and balance between fundamental rights and DPSP. Right? Now, is the word socialism part of basic structure doctrine? It should have been, no? No? Right? In the triple SDR, sovereignty, secular, democratic, republic. Right? All of these are part of basic structure in one way or the other except socialism. So write down, no socialism as part of, or socialism is not part of. Socialism is not part of basic structure doctrine. Right? Of getting into individual principles of the preamble. We see the first one is with respect to sovereignty. Right? The first one is with respect to sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is all about, one is independence, and sovereignty is all about managing own affairs. Right? Sovereignty is all about managing own affairs. Own affairs here fundamentally means both its internal aspects as well as its external dimension. That means it has its own understanding with respect to managing the external relations that are existing. The other thing that you would have to see is a security of the state is inherent part of it. Security of the state is inherent part of it. That is one. Then it is also abiding by the principles of non-interference. Right? Nobody can tell the state to what it wants to do or what it is supposed to do, right? It can do what it wants to do, but nobody can impose what it is supposed to do. So it fundamentally means that principles of non-interference is what it is, right? And in that context, we would have to understand what is the nature of the Indian Union that is seen to be existing. When you look at the nature of Indian Union, it is non-destructible union with destructible states, right now. Non-destructible union with destructible states. It is not based on agreement. It is not based on agreement. In bracket you write a union of states, not federation of states. Union of states, not federation of states. Right? Is it territory of India or Union of India? But which is more? I see the territory of India is definitely more than the Union. Why? Because this only constitutes states, but this constitutes states along with which Union territories, along with which the territories which are to be acquired. The territories which are to be acquired. So definitely the territory of India is seen to be having a larger expanse than Union of India, right? So that is the state, the Union territories and the territories which are to be acquired. But whereas in the context of Union, it is only the respective states. And one more thing that you would have to understand, write down one line. The word Bharat is interchangeably used in Indian Constitution. The word Bharat is interchangeably used in Indian Constitution. And here one small clarification that you need to do. That when you look at Article 2 and Article 3, you know that Article 2 and Article 3 fundamentally gives you a capacity to modify, change, add, all of this. But one thing that you have to understand is these are not the territories of India. That means that you want to add, that you want to acquire. In the context of Article 2, it is dealing with those things which are acquiring from outside, which are not the original territories of India, one. But whereas in the context of original territories of India with respect to Article 3, in Article 3, you can change the boundaries. You can change the boundaries. You can not only change the boundaries, but you can also change the respective name. Right? It is not only with respect to the boundary, but it is also with respect to the name that can be changed here. Now, and in this, not only that, we can either join or remove a respective territory on this basis. We can join or remove a respective territory on this basis, that is Article 3, Article 2. And you definitely know that Article 4 of Indian Constitution fundamentally says that activities under Article 2 and 3 are not a part of Article 368. They are not part of Article 368 because they are not subjected to, or they are not considered to be the part of constitutional amendment procedure. Right? So that is one simple understanding that you have to have. But there is one small prerequisite that has to be followed in this procedure of Article 3, that it has to be with the prior permission of the President. It has to be the prior permission of the President. Not only the prior permission of the President, but you also have to understand, when you look at this, you also have to understand the respective thing has to be referred to the state. Right? It has to be referred to the state, one. It is with respect to the prior permission of the President, two. And one more, the consent of the state or the decision of the state or the resolution of the state is the resolution of the state or the consent of the state or the decision of the state is not binding. It is not binding on precedent. It is not binding on precedent. So more or less it is more of a one-way communication, but we are doing certain token mechanism here. And token procedures which are being followed just by referring it to the state. Arey Babu, we are changing a boundary. We are doing respective changes, right? And we have taken the permission of the president. And whatever you want to do, you do. But if you are doing something, it is not binding on us, right? So that is one fundamental aspect that you need to understand with respect to this. Now, one more small consideration that we have to have here as part of sovereignty. When you look at these external territories, I see whenever we are losing some territory to someone else, right? Whenever we are losing some part of our land to someone else in the procedure, and whenever we have some kind of exchange of the territory which is going on, and whenever we have some exchange of territory which is going on, and whenever we see that there is some sort of loss of land which is seen to be happening, at this particular case, I would definitely require a constitutional amendment. I would definitely require a constitutional amendment which is seen to be happening and which is seen to be existing. Right? Now, one more small understanding is whenever I see some kind of resolution being present or some kind of regime being present with respect to these external territories, all that you have to understand here is it would just require an executive action. It would require an executive action. Right? Now, one example for this, the losing or exchange of territories is with respect to the 100th Constitutional Amendment. In the context of 100th Constitutional Amendment, what is that, my dear? That is the land boundary agreement between India and Bangladesh. And that is a constitutional amendment. But whereas when we look at this particular dimension, resolution, regime, there has to be an executive action. One simple example is in the month of January, we had removed this regime of free movement regime. Right? Because when you look at this free movement regime or FMR, what happens is when you look at the regions of Myanmar, once upon a time up to 16 kilometers, anybody can move in or out. And that 16 kilometers bandwidth was what was considered to be free movement regime. Now here what happened in the month of January, considering the security conditions, India has repealed and India has removed this provision of free movement regime. And there we did not bring in any amendment. We only had a executive resolution, we only had an executive order coming out saying that from today we see that the FMR is going to be redundant. Right? So that is one fundamental understanding that you need to have here. Right? These are all some dimensions with respect to the aspect of sovereignty. Next, socialist. Now when we look at socialist dimension, right, but I keep writing. I don't expect me to dictate everything. I would dictate when it is required with respect to snippet, but I can't dictate some aspects like these, right? So it's an imperative on us. It is on you to sit and write all of this, right? Because what is the approach that we follow with respect to polity is not remember the articles, but we only remember the exceptions, right? That is the way that we approach polity, especially for prelims examination. When we are solving a question, we would only remember those exceptions. Why? Because 99% of the times UPSC questions on exceptions. That is the reason why most of our elimination techniques that we try to derive fail with polity. Why do they fail with polity? For example, one elimination technique which everybody would have heard is if it is an extreme statement, please eliminate it, right? But that would not work out with polity because 99% of the questioning of polity comes from exceptions. Right? You see that every provision has a respective exception which is existing. Right? So whatever we are focusing for next 4 or 5 days in the context of polity is only exceptions. We are not focusing on the core. You don't expect me to teach you every article. Okay. Now, in the context of socialist, one dimension that we understand with respect to socialist is, we know that state happens to be the central entity. We know that the state happens to be the central entity which is seen to be existing. And not only that, what actually gives me a characteristic feature of socialist is, we see the dimensions of the era of planning. The era of planning fundamentally indicate that once upon a time India had a socialist tendencies which are seen to be existing. And we also see socialism as a principle was inspired from USSR. It as a principle was inspired from USSR. And not only that, one more evidence which is given with respect to socialist and socialism as a principle here is, we see majorly the public sector units. Now, when you look at public sector units, there is one fantastic line which goes on in the circles of governance where they say, there is no business, or government has no business to do business. Now, when they say government has no business to do business, that is fundamentally more to deal with the capitalistic tendencies which are seen to be existing. But in most of the socialist tendencies, we see the state happens to be the central entity for production systems. So that is one evidence when you talk about the socialistic tendencies which are seen to be existing, right? So that is, these two are some of the evidences which are present. One is the planning era, the other one is the public sector units. Now, keeping that, when you look at this planning era, we see there are three kinds of planning which goes on. One is the indicative planning. One is the indicative planning. The other one is imperative planning. One is indicative planning. The other one is imperative planning. The other one is prospective planning. The other one is the prospective planning. Just write down. Indicative. Write down one line. It is inclusive in nature. It is inclusive in nature. It is majorly decentralized. It is inclusive in nature. It is majorly decentralized. And it involves both public and private entities. It involves both public and private entities. Next, imperative planning. Imperative. It is a kind of planning. It's a kind of planning where the complete control. It's a kind of planning where the complete control is in the central authority. Is in the central authority. Next, there is a clear structure and hierarchy. There is a clear structure and hierarchy. Next, prospective planning. Prospective planning, which involves which involves long-term strategies, clear objectives, and large time periods. Right? Now here, indicative is more what, my dear? Inclusive. Imperative is more imposing. Why? Whole of the central entity is, or the central authority is the responsible dimension here, imposing. Imperative is imposing. And when I look at Prospective, it is more to do with what, my dear? It is more to do with the long-term understanding. Imperative is imposing and indicative is inclusive in nature, and the prospective is long-term planning. Now that means when you look at the phase shift that has happened in the context of understanding of socialist tendencies, we see that once upon a time we say we are socialist, but are we still socialist? No. What is the nature of Indian economy today? Mixed economy. Now that means I see that the mixed economy as such can have two perspectives. One particular perspective that I can see here is with respect to the public sector and the private sector. That is one fundamental perspective when I say it is mixed economic systems. Another perspective that I can see with respect to mixed economic systems can be it is having a mixture of the socialist tendencies as well as the mixture of the capitalist tendencies. It is having a mixture of the socialist tendencies as well as the capitalist tendencies. So that means in the context of mixed economic understandings, I can have any of these systems which are existing. And I also get to understand whenever I talk about this mixed economic systems and whenever I talk about this dimensions, in the context of socialist, we were seeing that the government entity was more to do with business. And not only the government entity was more to do with business, but government was also a regulator to a larger extent. Because when you look at the license Raj, when you look at the inspectorate system that was seen to be existing in that context, what do you observe? You see government was more of a regulator in that. But these days what happens is you also see a phase shift that is happening in the context. The government has shifted from being a regulator to facilitator. It is no more a regulator, but it is facilitator, right? And government has no business to do business. So that means we see that the business is now more of a mixed composition that is seen to be existing and a role of private sector. So one simple understanding that you have to have is government has shifted from being a regulator to facilitator today. So that is another simple conceptual understanding that can be derived from the socialism and as it is part of the dimension. Next, secularism. I know. Secularism. Added by 42nd Constitutional Amendment. Added by 42nd Constitutional Amendment. Not mentioned in original Constitution. Added by 42nd Constitutional Amendment, not mentioned in original Constitution. Follows equidistant principles. Please cut the not. Follows equidistant principles. Equidistant principles. No discriminatory practice by state. No discriminatory practice by state except in case of welfare. No discriminatory practice except in case of welfare. Next, reasonable interventions of the state. Reasonable interventions of the state. Next, considered as positive form of secularism. Considered as positive form of secularism. Next, no strict separation between religion and state. No strict separation between religion and state. Next, does not explicitly talk about the nature of secularism. Does not explicitly talk about the nature of secularism. Right? Now that means, what is a simple classification I know? Is it mentioned in constitution? Yes. Is it defined in constitution? No. Is the nature of secularism mentioned in the constitution? No. Nature of secularism is not mentioned in the constitution. Nowhere it is said it is positive form. Nowhere it is said that it is equidistant. All that you know about Indian secularism is between Article 25 to 28. That's it. And 25 fundamentally talks about what? It is everybody's right to practice, preach, profess. But it also says that there are reasonable restrictions which are imposed with respect to Article 25. And what are those reasonable restrictions which are imposed with respect to Article 25? One is with respect to the public, morality, health, law and order. But all of us would only constitute these three. But you have to understand there is fourth reasonable restriction which is talking about upon secularism. The fourth reasonable restriction that it says is any other fundamental right. That means, if any other fundamental right is being breached in the name of Article 25, you would see that Article 25 will stand as null and void. That means, you would always see any other fundamental right will prevail over Article 25. For example, Shabarimala case. In the context of Shabarimala case, what is happening, my dear? Or it might be with respect to Haji Ali Dargah. Or if you look at Shabarimala case, what is happening in the context of Shabarimala case? There is a claim that there is breach of Article 14, Article 17, Article 19, Article 21. Now, all of these are being breached in the name of Article 25 of the Constitution. And fundamentally what happened? Depending upon the reasonable restrictions which have been imposed, it says Article 25 is null and void because these fundamental rights are prevailing over Article 25. So reasonable restrictions is all about what? Reasonable restrictions is, I see some sort of exceptions for the rights which are given to the citizens which are existing. And in those conditions, I would not see my rights prevailing. Right? And in that condition, that is where we talk about these reasonable restrictions to be existing. So it is not mentioned, it is mentioned, it is not defined. The nature of the constitution or the nature of secularism in the constitution is not mentioned or it is not defined again. One more, are the principles of constitution present or the principles of secularism present in constitution? Yes. So with respect to secularism, it is mentioned, it is not defined, nature is not specific, but the principles are present in the constitution. Right? So these are the four dimensions which you have to remember with respect to secularism. Right? Next. Now there was a lot of controversy that was going on with respect to AMU in the recent past. Aligarh Muslim University with respect to minority educational institutions, right? So that section becomes important, and when I'm discussing Article 29 and 30 as part of fundamental rights, I would fundamentally emphasize upon those dimensions, right? Because that is where UPSC catches. All of us will study the history of Aligarh Muslim University and go, but UPSC would not ask upon that. UPSC will simply ask about these dimensions, right? It would always extract the static behind the current affairs. Now, if I was just giving you one example, I was telling you that polymer chemistry wala example, bisphenol A. Right? Bisphenol A is used in which of the following? Now that year, why? Because there were a number of WHO reports which came out and said that the bisphenol A which was used in water bottles was getting contaminated and were contaminating water. Now everybody studied about history of bisphenol A, what is the chemical composition, somebody even had the chemical structure of bisphenol A. And they went to the exam, but UPSC played a master stroke asking application of bisphenol A. Now what is happening now? Do you call this question as random question? I would call it as current affairs. I would call it as current affairs. Why would I call it as current affairs? Because it is an imperative on your side to understand what is going on with respect to bisphenol. Are you understanding? UPSC plays a master stroke like this. Now everybody was studying about Ramsar. Right? Everybody was studying about Ramsar. And I don't know how many of you know this stat, that just in 2022 alone, there were 28 Ramsar sites which were added. Right now, the list has crossed 80 plus. Right? When we were celebrating 75 years of independence, we had 75 Ramsar sites. I think that was the target. So probably in 2022, 28 Ramsar sites were added to the list. Indian wetlands were added to Ramsar site list. Basic. Everybody was by-hearting Ramsar sites. UPSC wanted to satisfy all of that section and it gave one question on Ramsar sites, Hokera, those regions. Right? Shastamkotta, Hokera, that particular region, which are very famous, very common. But it played a masterstroke asking, why are wetlands considered as the kidneys of the world? Now is that random question? It is current affairs. That means what are we failing here, my dear? We are fundamentally failing to understand the mindset of UPSC. Why? Because the information outside is making a noise in your head. Very simple. We are all having the fantastic. For example, this year what happened in 2024? Everybody was by-hearting what was happening with respect to reintroduction of cheetah. Everybody was by-hearting where was cheetah born, how was cheetah born, how many it gave birth to, 4 cubs, 5 cubs, 8 cubs. Everybody kept the status of these cubs. Fantastic. They are very cute. And everybody even by-hearted what is the amount of money that was invested in reintroduction of cheetah. From which region did they get? Where did they reintroduce? What is the ecosystem of that? Simply UPSC came out and played a masterstroke with respect to cheetah question. Cheetah cannot roar. Now you started roaring and you started crying there. Is this random? Current affairs. It is a fundamental problem that we are not looking at the hindsight behind the current affairs. That is why in those 30 hours that I conduct, I don't teach you current affairs. I teach the hindsight behind current affairs, and last year we had 8 questions from that current affairs session. Straight, spot on. Straight and spot on from that 30 hours of current affairs. I had 91 pages of notes on an average. We had 8 questions spot on from those 5 days. Why? Because understand this philosophy. Very simple. And one more, the third statement in this year's question. Unlike the male lion, the male cheetah does not demarcate its territory by spraying. Acha. All of us were bothered about how many cubs did this male cheetah contribute to. But UPSC categorically focused upon whether it is demarcating its territory or not. Now when I say and when I use a logic saying that any animal demarcates its territory, for which I need not know whether male cheetah demarcates its territory or not. Even a dog demarcates its territory. Don't you think so? When you go in a normal vehicle, Naya vehicle, what it does an activity to demarcate its territory. To show that this tire I have already experienced, I know this. Yes. Now when a dog could demarcate, do you think male cheetah does not demarcate? Is this common sense or is this some magic that I am doing? Common sense. Pure common sense. Deriving the unknown from the known information. That is what I call it as elimination technique. That is what I call it as common sense, which is not so common. And all those people who don't have this common sense and who can't use it very commonly think that elimination techniques are not techniques. Very simple. My strong counter and strong answer to all of those people who think that elimination techniques are not techniques, it fundamentally means those people lack common sense. And all those people who have common sense will fundamentally understand that techniques are not techniques, they are mere application of common sense. I just showed you multiple examples. Understand the hindsight. Now if you go back and refer to the notes that I have given, every statement is a statement in the exam. Every statement was a statement, every statement is a statement, every statement can be a statement in the exam. That is what I call it as snippet notes. That is what I call it as snippet notes, that we will have to sit and by hand upon these dimensions, right? Now, let's look at this. Probably we would end with this for today. Okay. First day, let me not scare you, right? How is it going? Good? Understanding? Sleepy? నా వాయిస్ విన్న తర్వాత కూడా నీకు నిద్ర వస్తుందంటే నేనేం చేయలేను, right? Yes or no? That you would see the frequencies reverberating in your ear, right? Now when you look at democracy, I know one basic dimension is, what do we follow? We follow indirect democracy. We fundamentally follow indirect form of democracy. That means, is it the people or the representatives of the people? It is the representatives of the people who are going to be part of it, right? But whereas when you look at direct democracy is where people exercise the power, right? Direct democracy is where the people exercise its power. And we have some of the tools of direct democracy. One is referendum. The other one is recall. Now in the recent past, you would have heard about multiple dimensions on recall. Newspaper mein. Right? Does India have the provision of recall? Does India have the provision of recall? Yes, no. What do you mean by recall? When you elect somebody, if they are not performing, you put down somebody and give a chance to somebody else. Does India have the provisions of recall? No. Right? Or yes? You please understand. When you look at in the context of India, at the level of parliament, we don't have. At the level of state legislature, we don't have. But at the level of local governance, we have the aspects of recall. Especially in some of the states like Madhya Pradesh and some of the states like Chhattisgarh. They have certain provisions with respect to right to recall. Now that means, does India has an evidence of direct democracy? Does India have an evidence of direct democracy? Yes, India has an evidence of direct democracy, and the evidence of direct democracy is Gram Sabha. Gram Sabha is the evidence of direct democracy. Why? Because what is happening in Gram Sabha, my dear? They are the participant and they are the decision-making candidates. So that means people are exercising the power in the context of Gram Sabha. So when somewhere I can experience this direct democracy in the context of India, that is at the level of local governance. And just because at the level of local governance I can experience a direct democratic setup, I can definitely have some principles of right to recall also. Are you understanding this, right? Next, the other instrument that is present is initiative. Right? Initiative. The other one is plebiscite. The other one is plebiscite. This is plebiscite is all about what? Opinion. Opinion. Right? Then referendum is more to do with what? Settlement of a particular issue. When you look at initiative, in the context of initiative, initiative is to do more with proposal. Proposing a respective initiative, proposing a respective bill from the side of the public. So we see these four are the tools of direct democracy, and India has an evidence of direct democracy in the form of Gram Sabha, where we have some incidents of right to recall. But it is not present with respect to parliament, it is not present with respect to state legislature. Right? Now don't you think if India had right to recall even at the level of parliament and state legislature, right, we would have been dealing with greater levels of corruption in elections? Definitely yes. Right? The ruling party would woo away the opposition party by bulldozing the public for right to recall. Right? And I don't think there would be any opposition party which would exist then. Right? It would all be money power and muscle power which would be taken into the central stage. Now I also see there are two kinds of democracies in general. One is the procedural democracy One is the procedural democracy. The other one is substantive democracy. One is procedural democracy, the other one is substantive democracy. Now, when you look at this procedural democracy and substantive democracy, you have to understand the procedural democracy is with respect to focusing merely on procedures. Focusing merely on procedures, for example, elections. If a particular country, if a particular state is known to be abiding by the procedures alone, I call it as procedural democracy. But it is not only the procedures alone, but when you look at the substantive dimension that is seen to be existing, it is following the procedures, and it is not only following the procedures, but you also see that there is an aspect of welfare which is taken care. There is an aspect of welfare which is taken care in the form of the socio-economic development of the citizens of that particular country. Now, when I combine not only the procedures, but also the procedures with the outcome, procedures with the welfare, procedures with the socio-economic development of a particular country, of a particular citizen, I call it as substantive democracy. Right? Just write down one line. India is more of a procedural democracy. India is more of a procedural democracy and transitioning towards substantive democracy. And transitioning towards a substantive democracy. Now, one of the core principles of any democracy is rule of law. Rule of law. Write down. Is rule of law part of basic structure doctrine? Yes, part of basic structure doctrine. Controls unlimited power. One is part of basic structure doctrine. Two, controls unlimited power of authority. Unlimited power of authority. Three, it restricts the arbitrary application of law. It restricts the arbitrary application of law. Four, supremacy of law. Supremacy of law. And all are equal before law. Supremacy of law and all are equal before law. Inspired from UK. Next, inspired from UK. Inspired from UK. And upholds the principles of constitution. Upholds the principles of constitution. Now tell me one thing. Is the constitution sourced from people? Is a constitution sourced from people, or constitution becomes the basis for the administration of the people? Basis for the administration of the people. Right? So that is one simple understanding, because you would come across somebody called as A.V. Dicey. Now in the context of A.V. Dicey's understanding, what happens? He gives three principles for rule of law. And in that context, you have to understand India follows only two. It doesn't follow the third one, where he says that the constitution is sourced from public. Right? So one fundamental understanding is the rule of law which is followed by India does not abide by A.V. Dicey's principles, or does not completely abide by A.V. Dicey's principles or A.V. Dicey's understanding of rule of law. Right? So that is one simple understanding. Now there is one more variant of this, that is rule by law. Rule by law. Right? Right now. Law is used as tool of repression. Law is used as tool of repression. Next. No control on the authority. No control on the authority. Next, rules favoring certain sections of the society. Rules favoring certain sections of the society. Right? So this is with respect to certain broad understanding of nature of the Indian constitution and nature of Indian state. Right? Tomorrow we would enter into the objectives. Once we enter into objectives, then I would talk about certain bunch of doctrines which are followed, right? Because we have number of doctrines, right? Now, one doctrine that we could have spoken with respect to secularism is doctrine of essential religious practices, right? That I would anyway deal with that tomorrow. So, doctrine of essential religious practices from Shirur Mat case, it fundamentally talks about what? Judiciary stating a certain practice of a particular religion being essential or not. That anyway I would discuss when I am discussing tomorrow these bunch of doctrines, and then whenever I am discussing article 14 and when I am talking about equality, I would talk about doctrine of reasonable classification. Right? So there are bunch of 10-12 doctrines which you will have to understand. Sometimes UPSC might come up with questioning upon these doctrines and judicial doctrines sometimes. Okay. So we would look at those dimensions, right? One small thing that you will always have to do after the class is revise the notes, right? Revise the notes, and whatever source that we have specified, ensure that you are finishing that particular source before we finish the subject, right? If you are able to do that along with as we progress, I think these sessions will be more effective, and these sessions would actually make more sense with respect to what is going on in the class, right? So, polity would go on till which date? What is the schedule that we have seen? 25th, right? 26th is a revision break, right? After every subject we have given one day of break, such that you utilize the break, not sleep till 10 o'clock, right? You would think that that day sir is allowing me to sleep till 10 o'clock. If you don't want to sleep, and if you don't want us to allow you to sleep, we can keep the exam at 6 o'clock in the morning, no issue, right? So anything is fine, right? Hope the program is making sense now. Yes, it would as it progresses, right? We'll meet tomorrow. Thank you.